Which era of the NBA was the most exciting, had the most parity, and shaped the game to be a global phenomenon? Those are the questions I'm setting out to answer in this series, where I take a look at the eras throughout the last 40 years in the NBA. If you happen to miss part 1, cheap plug, I will link it in the description, as I spoke about the league in the 1980s and 1990s and gave them a grade. I think some will be surprised how those decades/eras panned out. So today, let's talk about the last 2 full decades, which in terms of the evolution of basketball, I feel are their own eras in themselves. The 2000s and the 2010s. While both had elements of decades before, these years were very transitional for the league in many ways, on and off the court. So to continue these comparisons, a quick rundown of how the scoring will go. I'll look at the champions and their legacy in the association, the parity during those years, were the titles won by one conference mostly, or was it a back and forth affair? Then I'll take a look at the prime players of those years and their impact on the game. Of course, because of how this works, some players will overlap decades, so I will take that into account, but we will focus on either their championship years or their best/award-winning years. So today, we will discuss the NBA eras ranging from the 2000s and the 2010s. But first, if you enjoy NBA breakdowns and analysis, please subscribe to the channel. We are working for that 2,000 sub mark and can't do it without you guys. Also, check out the GOATcast podcast, streaming live every week, with guests and some wild takes. Thank you, and now let's get into this. The 2000s were a decade that laid the foundation of what the association would eventually become today. From the overall company to the product to the players to the rules. With the internet and advancement in all forms of media, things were bound to reflect that progression. David Stern of the league as a whole was reeling from the retirement of Mr. GOAT himself, Michael Jordan, and the dismantling of that historic Chicago Bulls team, and needed a spark to keep and gain interest in the game moving forward. Here's a quote from Mark Cuban when speaking on the 2000s in the NBA. The 2000s was also a time when almost every NBA team was losing money, a lot of money, and teams' values were declining. So it was natural for a company who through the 80s and 90s grew dependent on stars and superstars to sell the game to struggle with one of its biggest names ever left and one of their most popular teams disbanded. In came the 2000s Los Angeles Lakers, rising once again after their dormancy in the 90s. Lakers now with Phil Jackson, fresh off his extremely successful coaching career through the 90s, decided to try to tame even more egos in the massive Shaquille O'Neal and the rising Kobe Bryant. The 2000s champions-wise, would be a war between Western Conference powerhouses. Those early Lakers with Shaq and later prime Kobe's Lakers and the Tim Duncan-led San Antonio Spurs, continuing their success from the late 90s. These two franchises would combine for 7 of the championship runs throughout the 2000s, with the Detroit Pistons with Chauncey Billups, Rip Hamilton, Rasheed Wallace, Ben Wallace bullying a ring from the Lakers. Meanwhile, the 2006 Miami Heat with the young Dwayne Wade and fresh from LA Shaq would grab one, and the groundbreaking super team, the 2008 Boston Celtics, brought another Larry O'Brien to Boston. The West would take back their supremacy in the NBA throughout this decade, bringing home 7 out of the 10 championships throughout those years, having the parity pendulum swing from the 90s. While I won't spend much time on the return that probably shouldn't have happened, the repackaged Washington Wizards, leaving behind their Bullets moniker due to the negative connotation associated with it and the rise in violence across the country, had a new regime which consisted of part owner and head of basketball operations, the GOAT himself, Michael Jordan. With his new role and the competitive bug getting the best of him, he returned in the 2001-2002 season as a member of the Wizards and wasn't necessarily bad, but not many will look back on his Wizards tenure and use it in any GOAT debate. While having a few flashes of his former greatness, Jordan would have an okay return in that season, though injuries hampered him, and the next season saw Father Time lace up his Jordan brand kicks and really lock down the once nearly unstoppable shooting guard and finally send him to retirement for good. The 2000s would unfortunately be known for one of the most controversial and league-shaking events the NBA has ever seen. The Malice in the Palace. In 2004, a heated game between the Indiana Pacers and hard-nosed Detroit Pistons would change the game forever. After a scuffle between controversial figure Ron Artest and big man Ben Wallace, while the rest were trying to figure out the penalties between the players, a fan threw a drink at Ron Artest and a player-fan brawl ensued. While I'm not going to recap everything, then Commissioner David Stern laid out strict changes for the league to keep those types of heated exchanges to a minimum, and even dress codes to attempt to move the league into what he deemed a more professional light. The 2000s would also be the years that began the foreign player expansion. Led by Dirk Nowitzki, who had been drafted late in the 90s, a new era of drafted stash players would become the norm, as the game continued to take efforts to globalize its fan base. We saw great foreign players like Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, Yao Ming, the aforementioned Dirk, Peja Stojakovic, the Gasol brothers, among others. revolutionizing the game by introducing the Euro step and changing the tried and true use of the big man, having near 7-footers taking shots from the three-point line at a much larger clip. The league would also try to speed the game up even more from the plodding 90s, shortening the time to advance the ball over half court and changing the defense, creating the defensive 3-second rule and abolishing the arm length away illegal defense rule while allowing zone defense for teams. The continued evolution of the athlete played a major part in the 2000s as well, as the agile center was still very much a prominent figure, but with the zone defenses being allowed and the speeding up of the game, teams would at times sacrifice size for agility and speed, with prime wings being some of the star athletes of that time like Kobe Bryant, Steve Nash, Allen Iverson, Tracy McGrady, Jason Kidd, Dwayne Wade, and oh yeah, some kid from Akron, Ohio, drafted #1 by his home state, one of the greatest of all time, LeBron James, taking over the mantle that Mike had left in the 90s and keeping the NBA as one of, if not the top sports league worldwide. Also, with advanced technologies came analytics. Now with the ability for many to watch footage on more than one media, stat nerds can analyze the game and come up with metrics, such as box plus minus, as well as player efficiency ratings, PER, created by John Hollinger, to rate a player's on-court productivity. All of these help shape the league as a foundation of what we see today. So how would I rate the 2000s out of 5 basketballs? Champions, 4 basketballs. I feel while exceptional teams, the Spurs teams just never captivated the fans, so those runs didn't have the appeal of past great teams like the 80s Lakers or 90s Bulls, while the Shaq Kobe Lakers did bring some prime time. Outside of the Lakers and Celtics revitalizing their longtime feud late in the 2000s, the champions of this time are often pretty forgettable, such as the Pistons team and even the 2006 Heat, who I believe should still thank the refs for that chip. Parity, 4 basketballs. Again, while there were phenomenal teams throughout the 2000s, some I didn't even talk about in the breakdown, such as the New Jersey Nets, Sacramento Kings with Chris Webber and company, Dirk's Dallas Mavericks team, and Mike D'Antoni's 7 seconds or less Phoenix Suns, who really sped the game up for entertainment. But it just seemed like every year for many years, it could go to either the Spurs or Lakers and just insert an Eastern Conference team in there. Prime players, 4.5 basketballs. Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, Steve Nash, Jason Kidd, Dirk Nowitzki, Tracy McGrady, Yao Ming, Allen Iverson, Kevin Garnett, Shaquille O'Neal, Dwight Howard, young LeBron James. I could keep going, but there's just a few of the absolute stellar players that came through the 2000s. So the 2000s average is 4.2 basketballs. Now the 2010s, an era that we are not far removed from. The 2010s, I feel, began what we now know as the new norm for the NBA and basketball period. It's all about the 3-ball now. We can name this decade/era several things. The tale of traveling LeBron, and no, not the infraction he rarely gets called for, the Dynasty Warriors, or the era of the 3. Any of those fit that 10-year run and basically break down the years to come. After Kobe and the Lakers vanquished the Boston Celtics and got their revenge from 2008, the 2010s saw one of the biggest events to change the current landscape. The self-proclaimed king LeBron James made a huge decision and took his talents to South Beach and followed the 2008 Celtics lead and created a super team alongside D-Wade and Chris Bosh. The old guard remained steady to start the decade as Dirk, with the past his prime Jason Kidd, Jason Terry, Sean Marion, the Dallas Mavericks, smoked the new super team with LeBron and crew. The Heat would finally find their footing, grab Larry O'Brien from out west and bring it back to the Eastern Conference. LeBron in the 2010s was a force and firmly cemented himself as the face of the NBA. He also collected a nice collection of hardware during those years. With LeBron being the face of the league during this time, he just didn't have the full mystique of Jordan and those Bulls. As every time it seemed LeBron had ascended to that mythical, unstoppable level, his contemporaries brought him crashing back down to earth as the 2014 Spurs handed out one of the most one-sided beatdowns in NBA Finals history, with Tim Duncan's career winding down and a new quiet assassin beginning his rise in Kawhi Leonard leading the effort. And then, the evolution came in the form of a young team built on the draft, tough coaching, and a stylistic change that blended systems like Coach Pop's ball movement with Mike D'Antoni's quick and speedy offense. The Golden State Warriors through the second half of the 2010s created what could have been one of the best dynasties in a few generations and completely changed the way teams constructed their rosters to this day. I'll get into some of that later in this breakdown, but with all that said, Golden State continued the success the Western Conference found and won 3 rings from 2015 to 2019. With LeBron returning to a revamped Cleveland Cavaliers with young star Kyrie Irving and bringing in Kevin Love, the beast from the Timberwolves, to construct a team that put together possibly the greatest comeback in a championship series ever. Finally, the East got a lucky break to close the decade as the Toronto Raptors, with their new acquisition, the aforementioned Kawhi Leonard, was able to bring Canada their first NBA chip. Parity? Well, once again, the Western Conference continued their dominance from the 2000s, winning 6 of the 10 championships in that decade. These were the years that the Eastern Conference was dubbed the Leastern Conference, as the Boston Celtics began to grow old, and it seemed the newer upstarts like the Chicago Bulls with Derrick Rose, Pacers with Paul George, and Knicks with Carmelo Anthony could never put a solid run together, whether it was injuries or just the inability to get past those LeBron-led teams. The 2010s basically ushered in positionless basketball. The rosters you see now, whether in the NBA, AAU, or school basketball, can thank this decade for the new way coaches and organizations think. As analytics advanced even further from the 2000s, teams and experts could now run numbers and find spots on the floor that had a higher percentage of being effective and thus bringing in players that could fit those roles, with bigs typically being slower and less agile than more compact players. As well as the continued evolution of the athlete that happens throughout these decades, teams began to roll out 5 guys that may have the height differential of an inch or two, and each being able to essentially play all 5 or at least 4 positions and fit wherever needed on the court. This is why a team, Golden State, with a center only 6'7", was called the death lineup, due to their ability to swarm offenses with lanky and quick guards and wings, creating easy buckets and not needing to slow down for bigs to get in place. With most teams spreading the floor to the max, you can at least say that defense is a little more complex and strategic nowadays than the days of the 5-position roles of old. While LeBron James became the face of the NBA, it was a baby-faced kid who made a name for himself with an incredible NCAA March Madness run with his Davidson team. Yeah. Steph Curry changed the way kids and even up-and-coming athletes studied the game, with analytics proving that the three-point shot was actually slightly more efficient than long mid-range jumpers. No longer a role designed for 1 or 2 players on the team, it was now an essential part of almost every player's repertoire. Steph taking it to another level, learning from his father, the famous three-point specialist Dell Curry, and perfecting the shot with nearly pinpoint accuracy from almost anywhere beyond the half-court logo and even at times from there. Now if you go to your local AAU tournaments or high school games, teams are constructed with at least 3 guys that can shoot the 3. Also, players began their own movement of teaming up with other stars in hopes of quickly gaining championship success. As noted, LeBron, D-Wade, and Chris Bosh did it. We saw the newly located Brooklyn Nets attempt it with Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, Joe Johnson, and Darren Williams. Chris Paul joining Blake Griffin and DeAndre Jordan to create Lob City to minimal success. However, the boldest move came with Kevin Durant, considered one of the best scorers in the NBA throughout those years, joined forces with the already successful Golden State Warriors to create a God mode for an already OP team. As mentioned, snagging titles in the process. Prime players during those days are many of the guys that are still holding on. LeBron James, Steph Curry, Kawhi Leonard, Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, Chris Paul, Kyrie Irving, Carmelo Anthony, Derrick Rose, James Harden, who I haven't even mentioned, but I'd be here forever detailing every player of that era. Young Anthony Davis and Giannis Antetokounmpo, as well as some of the old guard fading into the pastures such as Dirk, Kobe, D-Wade, and Tim Duncan. So rating the 2010s, champions, 4.5 basketballs. Even though the West controlled the rings for the most part, there were some great teams to come out of that decade with championships. From the 2011 Dallas Mavericks getting revenge over their 2006 failure, the Heat back-to-back wins with the nail-biter in 2013, Duncan getting one more and us getting to witness the beautiful basketball Spurs, showing that just having talented players won't always get you to the top, and of course those Warrior teams and the epic 2016 Cleveland Cavs. Parity, 3.5 basketballs. When you dub one conference the Eastern Conference, doesn't really feel like a lot of equality. While the West had some wild firefights for the first half, once the Warriors emerged, the only question was will they play LeBron again? Prime players, 5 basketballs. Some really spectacular and game changers during this decade. The continued evolution of LeBron, Kevin Durant, Stephen Curry, Kawhi Leonard, James Harden, and up-and-coming monsters Anthony Davis and Giannis proves that the decade was stocked full of big names and stars. So the 2010s average is 4.3. So yes, I have the 2010s slightly above the 2000s with my metric, and I will live by that. I think the drastic change from the 2000s to 2010s as far as positionless basketball and the analytic of relying heavily on the 3 boosted some of the interest, if not at least for a few years. As it's progressed to today, it has created a somewhat less exciting product as watching guys jack up 3s for 3 or 4 quarters gets redundant. I still have one more in the series where I will rank the eras from least favorite to favorite, so look for that in the next coming weeks. Also, if you haven't checked my breakdown of the 80s and 90s, please check the description or wait until the end so that you can click on the link. But how about you guys? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments section. Also, if you want to ascend to GOAT status like number 23, please like and subscribe to the channel to help us grow and continue to provide content. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.